The first time Emmeline heard the word spoken aloud in a London ballroom, it fell from the lips of Lady Dorothea Hartwell with the precision of a woman who had spent 60 years deciding which syllables were weapons. "My son's ward," the dowager said to a cluster of women arranged like flowers around the refreshment table, each of them holding a glass and a small smile calibrated to the occasion. A provincial girl. Her father was an old acquaintance of Andrew's. Nothing more. She is here under his protection while suitable arrangements are made. Emmeline stood 4 feet away. She was near enough to hear every word, and too far away to be addressed. She kept her hands loose at her sides, her ivory fan closed, her chin at the angle her mother had once called dignified, and her Uncle Gerald called stubborn. She had been in London 9 days. What she had learned in those 9 days was this. The word ward, in the mouth of Lady Dorothea, was not a statement of guardianship. It was a sentence. It told every hostess in the room where to place Emmeline in the architecture of a table seating, which invitation she warranted, which men were worth directing toward her. Ward meant temporary. Ward meant no fortune and no family name of sufficient weight. Ward meant she had arrived at the season's court without credentials, and everyone could see it. Emmeline folded her fan along its ivory ribs, once, deliberate, and did not look at the dowager. Across the ballroom, she could feel the Duke of Hartwell watching. She had not looked at him directly since they had entered together an hour ago, she at his left and half a pace behind, because no one had told her where else to stand. He had said nothing to her since the carriage. He had said very little to her in general these 9 days, beyond brief instructions delivered in a low, even voice that she could not decide whether to read as indifference or as the practiced economy of a man who had stopped wasting words on things he could not fix. She did not look at him now. She was not certain she wanted to know what his face held. That was where the story stood, 9 days into her first London season, when Emmeline Ashworth was 22 years old and being discussed 4 feet away by a woman who had already decided what she was. It had begun 3 weeks before that, in a solicitor's office in Wiltshire, where a man named Mr. Oakes had read her father's will aloud in a voice that suggested he had delivered better news to other families and preferred those appointments. Emmeline's father, Sir Horace Ashworth, had died in February of a fever that had come quickly and taken him before anyone was quite ready to accept that it intended to. He had left Emmeline the house at Dorset Lane for the period of 3 years, a small annual income that would not survive London prices, and the legal guardianship of one Gerald Ashworth, her father's younger brother, a man whose primary qualification for the role appeared to be his proximity on the family tree and his willingness to accept the appointment. Gerald had been present at the reading. He had nodded at each point as though it were a ledger being totted up, which, Emmeline suspected, was precisely how he experienced it. There had also been a letter. It had been addressed in a hand she did not recognize, sealed with a crest she recognized immediately, because it appeared on the stone above the front gate of Hartwell House in Grosvenor Square, which she had seen in an illustration in a geography of English estates her father had kept on the study shelf. The Duke of Hartwell had written to say that he had known Sir Horace Ashworth for 15 years, that he was aware of the family's present circumstances, and that if Miss Ashworth was without suitable London prospects for the season, he was prepared to assist in the matter of introductions. The letter was formal. It was also specific in a way she had not expected from a man she had never met. It named the season's opening date. It named his town address. It suggested she write to his housekeeper, Mrs. Phoebe Lamb, to arrange a suitable time for arrival. Gerald had read the letter twice, the second time more slowly, as if calculating what it was worth. It was Gerald who had used the word ward first. He had said it at dinner 3 days later, offhandedly. as though testing whether the word would hold the shape of the thing he wanted it to mean. Andrew Nielsen, the Duke of Hartwell, had apparently agreed to introduce Emmeline to London society. Gerald had apparently decided that the best way to explain this arrangement was to call it what it was not. And the Duke, for reasons Emmeline had not yet understood, had not corrected him. She had arrived at Hartwell House on a Tuesday morning with 2 trunks and Mrs. Lamb waiting on the step. Mrs. Lamb was small, brisk, and somewhere past 60, with the bearing of a woman who had learned to manage a great house by deciding which details deserved attention and which did not. She had shown Emmeline to a room on the 2nd floor overlooking the garden, told her the household kept country hours and that His Grace preferred a quiet breakfast, and then looked at Emmeline with an expression that suggested she was cataloguing something and not yet prepared to share her findings. Andrew had received Emmeline in the library that first afternoon. He was taller than she had constructed in her imagination, which she had tried not to do and had done anyway. He had dark hair worn without excessive dressing, a face that had been arranged by some combination of character and weather into something that gave nothing away easily, and eyes of a gray so particular that she found herself thinking of winter rivers. He had offered her tea. He had asked whether she had eaten on the journey. He had told her, in 3 level sentences, that the Harrington ball was on Friday, that she would need a gown suitable for the occasion, and that Mrs. Lamb would arrange it. She had said, "That is very kind of your Grace." He had said, "It is necessary," and had returned to the letter on his desk. She had drunk her tea. If you have ever watched someone navigate a room where the rules are real and the penalties for misreading them are immediate, you will understand exactly what Emmeline's first week looked like. If you are new to this story, stay with it. The machinery is important. The ward label did its work across those early weeks with the quiet efficiency of a thing designed for exactly this purpose. Hostesses received her warmly and placed her near the edge of their tables. Mothers angled their daughters into the spaces beside Hartwell when he appeared at any function and steered those daughters away from Emmeline with a subtlety that was nearly invisible and nearly painless. Miss Cecily Vane, who was the season's acknowledged beauty by the common consensus of every drawing-room in Mayfair, and who knew it with a serenity that was not quite humility, had smiled at Emmeline at the first major introduction and said something pleasant about the cut of her gown that managed to communicate, through no single identifiable word, exactly how much lesser it was than her own. The dismissive label had its second voicing in public at the Pemberton breakfast 3 weeks into the season, when Lady Pemberton, a woman of great social assurance and small imagination, introduced Emmeline to a group of guests as "Hartwell's ward, you know, the provincial girl he's taken under his notice." And the group had nodded with the satisfied air of people who have been given a category and filed it correctly. Emmeline had smiled and asked Lady Pemberton about the arrangement of the centerpiece flowers, which were interesting, and had spent the next 10 minutes listening to a detailed account of where they had been sourced, which was more interesting than it sounded because it was honest. Andrew had appeared at the edge of the group at some point during the flower conversation. He had not entered it. He had stood at a slight remove, holding a cup he did not appear to be drinking from, watching Emmeline with an expression she could not read from the angle she was at. When she had glanced toward him, the expression had already arranged itself back into its customary stillness. She had looked away. It was the pattern. She had begun to catalogue it without intending to, the way one catalogues weather when one has no shelter and must predict it to survive. He appeared at the edge of events where she was present. He did not seek her out directly. He said things like, "Stay near the window, the air is better," and "Do not let Fenton refill your glass, his claret is inferior," and once, at a dinner where Gerald had been present and had spent the entire first course angling for a private word with Andrew, "Sit down, Miss Ashworth. You do not need to excuse yourself." She had not been intending to excuse herself. She had merely stood. She sat down. Gerald had found no private word with Andrew that evening. She thought, at the time, that he was managing inconveniences. She thought she was one of the inconveniences. Thomas arrived into the story one afternoon in the third week of the season, when Emmeline, returning from a walk in the square garden, found a boy of 9 years old sitting on the back stairs of Hartwell House, with his knees pulled up and his face held in the careful blankness of a child who has learned that crying in front of adults produces consequences rather than comfort. His name was Thomas Whitfield. She learned it from Mrs. Lamb, who appeared at the top of the stairs with the expression of a woman measuring the scale of a difficulty. Thomas was the son of Andrew's late steward, who had died the previous autumn. He had been at Hartwell House since Christmas, which made him, in the language of the household, a ward of record, and in the language of Thomas himself, as near as Emmeline could gather, a boy who had learned to be very quiet and take up very little space. She sat beside him on the back stairs. She did not ask what was wrong immediately. She asked whether he had eaten dinner, which he had not, and then she went to the kitchen and returned with a plate of bread and cold chicken, and sat beside him again while he ate it. By the time the plate was finished, he had told her, in the flat recounting of a child who has been over the facts several times already, that Mr. Gerald Ashworth had told Mrs. Lamb that a silver card case was missing from the small study, and that he, Thomas, had been the last person seen near the room. Emmeline kept her expression neutral. She asked Thomas, in a calm voice, whether he had been in the small study that afternoon. Thomas said he had gone in to retrieve a book he had left on the window seat 3 days ago. He had been in the room for less than 2 minutes. Emmeline asked whether he had seen anyone else near the study. Thomas said he had passed Mr. Gerald in the corridor on his way out. Emmeline was quiet for a moment. She had her own memory of that afternoon. She had been crossing the upper landing when she had seen Gerald pause at the study door, glance along the corridor, and go in. She had thought nothing of it. She was thinking about it now. She found Gerald in the front sitting room 20 minutes later. He was standing near the writing table with the air of a man who has recently decided where to stand and found the position satisfactory. She said, "I was on the upper landing at 2:30, Gerald. I saw you go into the study." Gerald looked at her with the expression she had seen on him since childhood, the one that said she was an obstacle whose degree of inconvenience he was calculating. He said, "Careful, Emmeline." She said, "Thomas was not in that room long enough to take anything." "You were." He said, "You are a ward in a borrowed house. That is not a position from which one makes accusations." She said, "I am telling you what I saw." She did not see Andrew in the doorway until after she had said it. He was standing with one shoulder against the frame, still in his riding coat, which meant he had come in recently, from whatever errand had taken him out that afternoon. His face held an expression she had not seen on it before, not the measured blankness of his customary register, but something more attentive. The quality of a man who has walked into a room expecting one thing and found another. Gerald saw him at the same moment. The calculation behind Gerald's expression shifted, recalculated, and then closed down entirely. Andrew looked at Gerald for 3 seconds. He said, "Mrs. Lamb will settle the matter of the card case," in a tone that indicated the matter was settled already, and Gerald's participation was not required. He said nothing to Emmeline. She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of her bed in the second-floor room overlooking the garden and kept her hands quiet in her lap until they stopped shaking. She did not know that he had watched the whole exchange from the doorway. She did not know that he had remained there a full minute after she had left the room. She did not know what he had said to Gerald after. though Gerald's manner toward her in the subsequent days acquired a wariness she had not seen in it before, which told her something. The silver card case reappeared on the study table the following morning. Mrs. Lamb said nothing about it. Thomas was not mentioned again. It was Mrs. Lamb who told her about the first wife. It was an afternoon in the 4th week of the season, on a day when rain had made the garden impassable, and Emmeline had found the small sitting room adjacent to the library and was reading in it. Mrs. Lamb appeared with tea she had not asked for, set it on the table at her elbow, and then, in the manner of a woman who has been waiting for the right moment and has decided this is near enough to it, sat down in the chair across from her. The East Gallery, Mrs. Lamb said, held a number of portraits. Most of them were the usual procession of Hartwell ancestors in successive fashions. There was one portrait near the end, facing the wall, which had been turned that way 6 years ago by Andrew's own instruction, and had remained so. It was the portrait of his first wife, a woman named Charlotte, who had been 24 when she died in childbed, while Andrew was in Scotland on estate business. He had been 4 days' ride from Edinburgh. The letter had reached him in 2 days. He had arrived on the 3rd day and found what he found. Emmeline set her book on her knee. She did not speak. Mrs. Lamb said that he had not spoken of Charlotte since the year after her death. Not to her. Not to anyone she knew of. She said that the house in Grosvenor Square had been purchased the year after that, as though a different London address could put something between him and the house where the event had occurred. She said that the ward arrangement, the unusual category into which Emmeline had been placed, had been his invention, and not Gerald's, though Gerald had been delighted to amplify it. She said Andrew had known Sir Horace for many years, and had made a promise to him in the last letter before the fever took him. A promise that he was apparently constitutionally unable to make more, simply because he did not know how to bring a young woman into his life, without a name that would protect both of them from what he could not yet say plainly. Emmeline looked out the window at the wet garden. A blackbird was sitting on the garden wall with the patient authority of a creature that has decided the rain is irrelevant. She watched it for a moment. She said, "He does not know what to do with me." Mrs. Lamb said, "He knows precisely what he wants to do. That is an entirely different difficulty." Emmeline carried that sentence up the stairs with her that evening. She set it beside the other catalogue entries she had been keeping, the cup he did not drink from at the Pemberton breakfast, the 3 seconds he had held Gerald's gaze in the study doorway, the room on the 2nd floor overlooking the garden that had been prepared before she arrived, as though someone had thought carefully about which room she would prefer. She set them all together and looked at the arrangement, and then she put it away, because she was 22 years old and living in a borrowed house under a borrowed label. And she had learned, in the months since her father's death, that the things one wanted most were precisely the things one had the least right to count on. What she did not yet know was that the counting was already being done elsewhere. The Hartwell ball was the occasion the Dowager had been building toward since the season began. Lady Dorothea had timed it with the calculation of someone who understood that the timing of a public announcement was itself the announcement. Hartwell House in Grosvenor Square was opened for the occasion. 140 guests on the list, the chandeliers lit from 6 o'clock, the musicians from the Philharmonic engaged for the evening at a cost that the household staff mentioned to each other in respectful tones. Emmeline wore a gown of pale green silk that Mrs. Lamb had overseen. Not grand, nothing like the diamonds and ivory satin of Miss Cecily Vane, who arrived on the arm of her mother in a configuration that suggested she had been positioned rather than guided. The ward label had its 3rd voicing of the evening, when Emmeline heard Lady Dorothea say to the Countess of Ashmore, not 3 feet from the hall entrance, "My son's ward, yes, The provincial girl. She has been underfoot all season, but the matter will be settled soon enough." And the word settled landed in Emmeline's chest like a key turning in a lock from the outside. She went through the first hour of the ball with the discipline she had been practicing since February. Straight back, quiet hands, civil conversation with whoever was nearest, a particular attention to the wallflower daughters of minor gentry whom no one else was attending to because she understood exactly what it felt like to be that girl in that room. It was midway through the second hour that Lady Dorothea called for attention. The dowager did not require a footman to do this. She simply stood at the center of the room and allowed her presence to gather itself. And the room quieted because rooms had been quieting around Lady Dorothea for 40 years and did not require instruction. She said that she was grateful to her son for the evening's occasion. She said that the season had brought much to celebrate. She said that she was pleased to indicate the good news, that further celebrations might be expected in the near future. And she turned with the precision of a woman who has rehearsed her blocking, and extended her hand toward Miss Cecily Vane. There were 140 people in the room. Every one of them understood what the gesture meant. Miss Cecily turned a color that might have been pleasure or might have been triumph, and stepped forward, and Andrew stood at the far side of the room with his face still as river ice, and said nothing. Emmeline looked at him once. His jaw was set. His hands were at his sides. His expression was the expression she had catalogued as indifference for 2 months, and now, in this moment, she understood was neither indifference nor its cousin. She understood it, and she looked away and she thought, "He will not correct her publicly. He will find a way to manage it privately, and the season will end, and I will go back to Wiltshire, and the portrait at the end of the East Gallery will remain facing the wall." She left the ballroom. No one marked it. She was the ward, and wards could be excused. She went to the library, because it was the room she had spent the most hours in since arriving, and because it had 2 deep chairs and a fire kept lit regardless of the season, and because she needed to be somewhere that did not require her to hold her face in a particular position. She sat at the writing table near the window. She took a piece of paper from the drawer. She wrote the letter in less than 10 minutes. It was addressed to Andrew. She wrote that she was grateful for his protection and his household and his patience with an arrangement that had served neither of them as either might have wished. She wrote that Mrs. Lamb had been particularly kind. She wrote that she intended to return to Wiltshire on the morning coach and that Gerald would manage the legal necessities. She wrote that she hoped he would be happy with Miss Vane, and then she stopped writing and sat with the pen still in her hand for a long moment, looking at those words, and then she put the pen down and folded the letter and left it in the center of the library table where it would be found. She went upstairs. She began with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has packed in a hurry before, to fold her dresses into the smaller of her 2 trunks. She did not hear him on the stairs. She heard the door. She turned. He was standing in the doorway of her room in Hartwell House for the first and only time, still in his evening clothes, the black coat and the white cravat, and the face that had been arranged back into its stillness, except that it had not, entirely, achieved it. He held the letter in his hand. He said, "You did not wait for my answer." She said, "I did not leave a question." He came into the room. She stayed where she was beside the trunk. He said, in a voice that was not quite level and was trying to be, "I have been managing this badly." She said, "You have been very kind." He said, "That is not what I mean, and you know it." She looked at him. She thought of the portrait facing the wall in the East Gallery. She thought of the letter that had reached him in 2 days. She thought of a man who had made a promise to her dying father, and then not known how to make it into something with a name, and who had chosen the nearest available name and called it guardianship, and spent 2 months watching her from the edge of rooms. She said, "Your Grace, Andrew, you do not owe me anything because my father asked you." He said, "I know that." She said, "Then what is this?" He was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said, "Come downstairs." She had no idea what he meant. She went downstairs. There were still 140 guests in the Hartwell ballroom. The musicians had resumed. The chandeliers threw their light across the room in a manner that had nothing to say about personal difficulty. Lady Dorothea was positioned near the windows with Miss Cecily at her left and the Countess of Ashmore at her right, a configuration of satisfaction that had been hours in the assembling. Andrew walked into the ballroom with Emmeline beside him, and the room did not quiet immediately, because it was a ballroom, and rooms with music do not quiet at a single entrance. Andrew stopped in the center of the floor. He waited. He had the particular capacity of a man accustomed to rooms arranging themselves around him, and the room, after a moment, began to do so. The musicians slowed and stopped in the natural way musicians stop when the room's energy asks it. The conversations thinned. Lady Dorothea's fan, which had been moving at a measured rhythm, slowed. Miss Cecily's expression, from across the room, registered something that was not yet understanding. Emmeline stood beside Andrew on the ballroom floor, with her heart audible in her own ears, and her hands entirely still, and her chin at the angle that had nothing to do with stubbornness and everything to do with the fact that this was the only posture she trusted herself to hold at the moment. Andrew said, in the carrying voice he used when he intended to be heard, and also when he intended there to be no confusion afterward about what had been said, "I have an introduction to make. This is Miss Emmeline Ashworth. She has been in my household this season under my protection, and I have been describing that arrangement imprecisely." He paused. It was a pause calibrated to let the room understand the weight of the next sentence. "I intend to ask Miss Ashworth to do me the honor of becoming my wife, if she is willing to correct my imprecision." The room did not make the sound one reads about in descriptions of dramatic ballroom moments. It made a different sound, the sound of approximately 140 people recalibrating something they had believed to be settled. Emmeline heard the recalibration. She felt the particular quality of Andrew's attention beside her, not toward the room, but toward her, as though the room had become irrelevant to the question he had just posed in front of it. She looked at him. His face had done something she had not seen it do before. The stillness was still present. But underneath the stillness, there was the expression of a man who has said the true thing in public, and is waiting, for the first time in 6 years, to find out what happens next. She said, quietly enough that only he could hear it clearly. "You might have asked me in the library," he said, equally quiet. "You had already written a farewell letter. I judged that the library had lost some of its persuasive authority." She held his gaze for a moment. Something in her chest, which had been held in a particular careful position since February, shifted. She said, "Yes." He said, "Yes?" She said, "Yes, I am willing." It was the smallest wedding answer ever given at a Hartwell ball, in front of 140 witnesses, none of whom had any difficulty hearing the silence that followed it. Lady Dorothea stood very still near the windows. Her fan had stopped moving entirely. There was, in the single short clause that crossed her face in that moment, the recognition that the architecture she had spent the season assembling had been set aside by her son with one sentence, and that the sentence was already irrevocable. She was 60 years old, and she knew when a thing was irrevocable. The calculation behind her eyes settled into something that was not defeat, precisely, but was the acknowledgement of a different reality than the one she had prepared for. Miss Cecily Vane looked across the ballroom at Emmeline Ashworth in a green silk dress standing beside the Duke of Hartwell, and then she looked away. She did not say anything. She had enough composure for that. Gerald Ashworth, who was standing at the edge of the refreshment table, set down his glass. He had, as Mrs. Lamb had once said of a particular piece of correspondence, nothing left to contribute to the proceedings. Andrew's solicitor, a man named Mr. Hartley, who had been present at the ball in a professional capacity, confirmed the following morning that no legal guardianship of formal record survived Andrew's direct announcement of his intention. Gerald's position as Emmeline's legal guardian, such as it was, had always been more social convention than ironclad law, and Andrew's direct choice made the question academic. Mrs. Lamb told Emmeline this in the small sitting room over tea, in a voice that managed to be both informational and satisfied simultaneously. She also said that she had attended every Hartwell ball for 30 years, and that this was the first time the musicians had stopped of their own accord, which she considered a point in the evening's favor. The season wound toward its close in the weeks that followed, and the ward label, stripped of its function, disappeared from the vocabulary of the drawing rooms where it had lived with such comfortable confidence. The Countess of Ashmore paid a call to Hartwell House and was received in the good drawing room. The Pemberton breakfast, which had previously placed Emmeline near the edge of its tables, issued an invitation addressed to Miss Ashworth in the front right hand of the note card that meant the hostess considered the recipient a primary guest. Lady Dorothea came to Hartwell House on a Thursday and was received by Andrew in the library. Emmeline was not present for the conversation. She walked in the garden instead, in the sharp autumn air. And when Andrew came to find her afterward, he said only, "My mother will come to Hartwell for Christmas." And Emmeline understood that the correction had been made and accepted in the way that corrections between proud people are made and accepted. Without full recitation of what had changed, and without a victor announced. They were married in October by the vicar of the Hartwell parish, in a ceremony attended by Mrs. Lamb and by 3 families of the neighborhood and by Thomas, who wore a coat that fit him properly for the first time since Christmas, and who sat in the front pew with the seriousness of a boy who understood the occasion was significant, and was determined to honor it correctly. Emmeline carried no flowers. She had found, the morning of the ceremony, a small sprig of late-season rosemary in the garden, which Mrs. Lamb said was for remembrance, and which she held loosely in her left hand throughout the service. Andrew stood beside her at the altar, with the expression she had finally learned to read. Not cold, not indifferent, not managing an inconvenience. Something else entirely. The expression of a man who has said the true thing twice now, and intends to make a practice of it. Early winter arrived at Hartwell, the estate in Derbyshire, where they went after the ceremony, with the particular authority of a northern winter that has no interest in being gradual about it. The house was large, larger than she had quite constructed from the description, with the kind of proportions that had been built by people who intended to remain in one place for a very long time, and wanted the walls to say so. There was a long gallery on the upper floor, and a kitchen garden, and a walled south-facing orchard, and a library that made the London Library look like an ante-room. Thomas arrived 2 days after the wedding, having traveled from London with Mrs. Lamb and 2 of the household staff. He came through the front door with his small trunk and his serious face, and looked at Emmeline in the hall, and she said, "The library has a window seat large enough for 3 people, and the view is to the south." And he said, "Can I put my books on the shelf?" And she said yes, and he went upstairs with a destination, and the particular purpose of a child who has been given permission to occupy space. Mrs. Lamb installed herself in the housekeeper's rooms with the air of a woman returning to a house where she belongs, which she was. Andrew and Emmeline walked the East Gallery on the second evening, after dinner, when the early dark had come down outside, and the candles in the gallery's sconces threw a warm amber light along the rows of Hartwell ancestors in their successive fashions. She walked the length of the gallery slowly. He walked beside her, not quite touching, the fraction of distance that was neither close nor far. At the end of the gallery, where the wall turned at a slight angle before the window, there was a portrait facing outward. It had not been facing outward when the season began. She knew this from Mrs. Lamb's account of it. The portrait turned to the wall 6 years ago. The instruction given without explanation, and held without revision. It was facing outward now. Charlotte Hartwell had been a fair-haired woman with an expression in the portrait that suggested she had been in the middle of thinking something when the painter caught her. It was not an unhappy expression. It was alert. Emmeline stood before it and did not speak for a moment. Andrew stood beside her. He said, in a voice calibrated to something between the formal and the ordinary, "She would have thought the Ward fiction was absurd." Emmeline said, "It was somewhat absurd." He said, "Yes." They stood in front of the portrait together for a little while longer, and it was the kind of silence that does not require filling. She thought of the folded letter she had left on the library table in London, the letter that had said goodbye before she had been given the chance to hear the alternative. She thought of the blackbird on the garden wall in the rain, sitting there with the authority of something that has decided the weather is irrelevant. She thought of Thomas on the back stairs, with his knees pulled up, eating bread and cold chicken with the careful dignity of a child who has been told to take up less space than he needs. The snow came that night. She heard it first as a quality of quiet rather than a sound, the particular hush of a world being covered, and when she stood at the window of the room that was now hers, the garden below was already white, the hedges softened, the stone of the walls holding a thin bright line of it along the top. Andrew came to stand beside her. They looked out at the snow together in the early winter dark. The house settled around them with the patient weight of a place that has been waiting for the occupants to arrive, and Emmeline felt, for the first time since February, not the careful management of endurance, but something else. She had been seen. Not the version the season had decided she was, not the Ward with no fortune and no family weight and no season's credentials. The actual version, the one who sat on back stairs with a plate of chicken, who told the truth in front of a man who outranked her by several orders of social magnitude, who folded her hands quiet and kept her chin at the angle she had chosen and did not ask to be chosen in return. The snow continued to fall outside the window. Inside Hartwell, at the end of the East Gallery, a fair-haired woman's portrait looked out at an empty hall with an expression that was not unhappy. In the library on the floor below, Thomas's books occupied a full shelf and a half, arranged by a system only Thomas could have explained. In the kitchen, Mrs. Lamb had already, on the evidence of the smells reaching the upper floor, decided what Hartwell House ate in winter and had begun providing it. Emmeline kept her gaze on the snow and felt Andrew's hand, quiet and warm, settle at the small of her back, the first time he had touched her with no purpose other than the touch itself, and she let herself lean, very slightly, into the presence beside her. The Ward label had dissolved. There was no particular ceremony to mark the moment it went. It had simply become, in the plain fact of things, a word that no longer named anything true. If this story moved you, leave a word in the comments. This channel exists because you stayed to the end of stories like this one. The snow kept falling on Hartwell. The candles in the East Gallery burned low and warm. Inside, it was very quiet, And that quiet had a different quality than any quiet Emmeline had known since her father's last winter. The quality of a house that has finally arranged itself around the people inside it and intends to remain that way.